Okay, so I'll just sort of start. I didn't know what to expect at this particular meeting, so I'm just gonna, I was told to sort of give a broad overview of of radio and pirate radio and LPFM and all this sorts of things, and which is something I've been looking at. I've been working in for decades. Really, I want to say a few things about myself, just so you know where I'm coming from. I do a lot of work in different areas. One of the sort of thing, one of the areas I work on are communes and collectives, because I lived on communes and collectives for years actually, as a kid, as a teenage runaway. And so that's sort of one of the areas that I work on. I work a lot in alternative media, and I had a long history in the labor movement. I worked in industrial plants and electronic plants and warehouses for over 10 years. I was a staff member of the United Farm Workers Union back in the day under Chavez. And so I didn't kind of come into academia until way later in life. And so here I am, a professor at UC Davis. I teach in the cinema and digital media program, and I'm also in community and regional development. I'm also the co-chair of the Davis Faculty Association, and I'm also on the board of the American Association of University Professors, and also on the board of something called CUFA, which is the Council of UC Faculty Association. So I'm pretty involved in terms of what's happening with labor in faculty in the UC system and in California. I worked in the electronics industry. I sort of transitioned from being an industrial worker into being an industrial worker in what was then starting to be called Silicon Valley. And so I worked in electronics factories, and I worked with the United Electrical Workers trying to organize some electronic plants. I got interested in electronics through that. And one thing led to another, and I sort of found myself working in electronic media. And then I'll kind of explain the transition into pirate radio. But so I have a background in electronics, which sort of led me into building transmitters and getting involved in that early on. So here at UC Davis, I teach radio production. I teach electronics for artists. I teach classical media innovation and community development, which two people here were in. I teach a class called media archaeology, which that's one thing I'm going to sort of bring up as I start this. And let's see, what else do I teach? I teach documentary theory, history, and production. So I have a lot of experience in filmmaking, video production, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So just to kind of get that out of the way. But I am very interested in radio for a lot of different reasons. I think radio is, in a lot of ways, is an ideal medium. It's cheap, it's ubiquitous, it's very accessible. And sort of easy to manage, and so I've been sort of involved in that. And I'm going to go into that sort of history. I'm curious here. Do you all have access to the chat thing here? I'm interested if you actually listen to radio, and I'm just kind of curious if there's a radio station that you listen to. Can you just type it into this window? I'm just trying to see if you even listen to radio. Okay, CalX. Okay. Anything else? WBEZ, or you mentioned that. That's public, yeah, or Cap Radio, KPFA, NPR. So one of the things I do when I teach radio is I sort of look at, I have people write down the radio stations that they listen to, and a lot of young people don't listen to radio at all. So, and that's fine, but I sort of bring up, I assign radio stations to people and have them do the research. Because just like every radio station has, well, not every, but a lot of radio stations have an unusual amount of history, and really fascinating to study a particular radio station. And some of the radio stations I assign seem like KUSF, for example. I don't know if you're familiar with KUSF. That was a USF radio station that was violently kicked out of their station a number of years ago. I don't know if you were aware of that, but KUSF was like the leading punk rock and hip hop station in San Francisco, and they were locked out and thrown out by police one night. Or KPFA, KSAN, which used to be sort of a very important FM radio station in San Francisco in the 60s. Let's see what else. Oh, WWVA, the voice of the American truck driver. XCRF, which is one of the big border blaster stations from Mexico. Radio Venceremos of El Salvador, which played a huge role in the revolutionary movement in El Salvador. B92 in Belgrade, which was very much, oftentimes radio stations, because of their almost clandestine ability formed the core of many revolutionary movements. As we all probably know, many revolutionary movements coalesce around a media organ. And traditionally it's been a newspaper, but it's also very often a radio station, because that voice helps keep these disparate connections going. And then you can hire a radio station, pretty good. Radio Alice in Italy, which was one of the first big pirates in Italy during the autonomous movement in Italy. And there's also some of their sister stations in France also. And I'm going to sort of go into that history. So I kind of just like to sort of show, like, people do listen to radio stations, and radio stations have a really kind of vibrant history. So what I'm going to do here, I'm going to walk through some stuff really quickly, an overview of actually the history of radio leading up into pirate radio. I'm going to try to get through this, somewhat quickly, so we can then spend some time talking and stuff. I just feel like I should lay out some of this stuff now, so to get it out of the way. Because I think it really, radio today, I think it's important to understand where it comes from, both technologically and, corporate wise. And let me see here. I'm going to switch to I'm going to share, I think I can share a screen from here. Let me go to this thing here. So this is your, let me see. Can you all see that? Yes? Okay.
Yes.
All right. This is going to be your very quick march through time, through the history of media archaeology. Well, hold on a second. I have to get this. I have to get this window out of here. For some reason, when I go to full screen, it takes away my ability to do this mouse. I saw this online the other day. I thought this was kind of cute, right?
It was a joke.
Right? What's that?
It was a joke that Jody was making, but I thought it was funny too.
Yeah, I think it's pretty funny. Radio, you're thinking of a radio. And I get that. Some people forget, like, oh yeah, we already have a technology that does that. Anyway, I'm going to walk you through this really quickly in terms of media archaeology. And Susanna, I apologize, because I know you've seen all this. The history of radio actually begins with the telegraph, of all things. The telegraph was a huge pivotal invention, in that it was the first real invention that allowed you to transmit a message electronically, because previously you had to go there in person. So that, the telegraph, comes out in the 1840s. It eliminates the, Pony Express, things like that. I'm just going to walk you through this really, really quickly. And of course, out of the Pony Express, you get things like Wells Fargo Bank. But of course, this idea of Morse code is really important, because it's a code that allows you to transmit information from a distance, right? And here's they're using Morse code with lights and mirrors. I think this is like on the battlefields of Gallipoli, if I'm not mistaken. So they're sending messages from a distance. Morse code is still taught today in the US Navy, because it's still used in case your ship is disabled. You can transmit information from light. Morse code, I don't know if you ever experimented with Morse code as a kid. And then this idea of transmitting information, though, to things out at sea, or a place where you can't run a wire, becomes really critical. The foghorn is still an advanced technology in that respect, because you could transmit information to ships, right, without a wire. But meanwhile, telegraph, required a wire. And so, sometimes I ask people, well, how do you think they got a telegraph message from New York to London? Certainly they didn't run a cable all the way across the ocean to do that. That'd be ridiculous. Of course, that's what they did. These are some of the cable routes, undersea cables that they would drop. That would connect the continents. Now, on the way to looking at how to improve the advancement of the telegraph, there was a person named Alexander Graham Bell who was trying to figure out a way to cram more messages down the telegraph wire, because previously you had to do it one message at a time, which was very time consuming and tedious. So along the way is where the invention of the telephone came from. It was really just supposed to improve the telegraph. Now, along those lines, there was a guy named Marconi who tried to figure out how also he could get Morse code messages through the air without using a wire. And he came out with a technique called the spark gap transmitter. And so what the spark gap transmitter was doing was sending sparks, blasts of electromagnetic energy through the airwaves. where you could pick them up from afar. Now this was not real, this is pretty crude information, right? It was just blasts, dots and dashes, but this was the beginning of broadcasting. This is one of Marconi's spark gap transmitters. Now this was sort of seen as not that interesting for a long time until this event, which of course is the Titanic. When the Titanic was starting to sink, and they actually had a wireless telegrapher on board. That kind of showed the sort of the power of transmitting messages through the air. Now, this is not modern broadcasting. This is called wireless telegraphy. Now, eventually in the 20s, you had a new invention called the Audion Tube, otherwise known as a vacuum tube, is invented. And that allows for something really unique to happen. And this is what really begins the electronic age. A radio tube not only can pick up signals, it can also transmit them. It can oscillate. You can tell and build an electronic circuit with a vacuum tube, and it will oscillate for you at high speeds if you want. And so using those high speeds, people who are trying to improve wireless telegraphy suddenly realize that, wow, we can actually transmit more than just dots and dashes. We can actually transmit our voice. And they do this through a process called amplitude modulation. And so let me sort of see if I can show this. So this is a high energy blast of electromagnetic energy. Let's just say it's, 680 kilohertz. And then you take your audio frequency, your voice, and you use your voice to modulate that carrier wave. This becomes radio, and this is really when radio takes off. So this is called, if you're modulating the amplitude, with amplitude, it's called AM, right? That's where AM radio comes from. And now, then there's another invention later on in the late 20s, and if you're also taking a carrier wave, but you're modulating it by frequency, not by amplitude, that makes it FM, or frequency modulation. So this is really the birth of modern broadcasting. Now this sort of overthrows the whole notion of the ether, which was the accepted explanation of how radio waves went from one place to another, seemingly, through the air. They believed that everyone was amassed in this stuff called the ether, which connected everything, which led to all kinds of other bizarre ideas like, mind reading and communicating with the dead and all these other things. But the industry pretty much, and the scientific method pretty much realized that this was all had to do with frequencies, different frequencies on the spectrum. And sort of jumping ahead a little bit, this is sort of like a basic breakdown of how the spectrum looks. So spectrum really refers to the range of broadcasting frequencies in hertz, or for the most part, kilohertz, megahertz, gigahertz. So that all that spectrum is divided up. You have the AM radio band, right? If you notice that if you look at the AM, coordinates, it's going to be within 535 or 1.7. And then you have all the other bands in your two: shortwave radio, citizens band. You have the audio portion of TV stations. Of course, you have your FM stations. You have more TV stations. And then you have all this other weird stuff too, right? Garage door openers, baby monitors, even toys, right? Radio control airplanes, cars, et cetera, et cetera. But of course, now you have the big bulk of spectrum has to do with, of course, cellular phones, which are just eating up the spectrum like unbelievably. This is the whole spectrum. It's considered the broadcast frequencies, right? Because too low a frequency, it's not useful for broadcasting. And of course, if you get a higher frequency, it becomes light, and that's not much use for us either. This is kind of a current allocation of US frequency allocations, otherwise known as the spectrum. And of course, the spectrum is, for all intents and purposes, I'm going to get out of this thing here so I can come back here, is spectrum is considered a limited amount of space, of course, which makes certain frequencies for radio and TV hard to get, and it's a coveted resource. So that's really where the whole battle comes over. It's all about spectrum, as you'll see. I'll kind of go back there and I'll sort of walk you through the sort of corporate division of the spectrum and why it's been so hard for the public to have access to the spectrum, and why you can get arrested for putting up a radio station, a pirate radio station. So that's a lot of blah, blah, blah more in the sort of historical, maybe a little bit on the technical side. I just wonder if anyone has any questions or anything they want to add until I sort of jump back into that and bring us up to pirate radio.
Jesse,
Yeah.
I did have a question, which was about citizen band radio, and I don't know if you're going to talk about that later, but I wasn't familiar with that designation. Could you elaborate a little?
CB radio. CB radio is like truck drivers radio, right? It's a certain band. You know, have you ever seen like you know, truck driver movies, Convoy? You know, it's a certain part of the bandwidth. It doesn't go very far, and it's not that powerful, but it's useful for communicating on the road. Are you familiar with the CB radio? I have one in my closet here. I can always bring it out. But that's what that is. Yeah. Also, you know, I mean, there's ham radio also, which is an important sort of part of that. And ham radio, also it's amateur radio. And one of the things I want to stress here, that let me take a sort of step back here, is when radio was first invented in the 20s, really in the teens, 20s, 30s, radio was really in the hands of amateurs. I mean, that's like where the notion of CB radio and ham radio comes from. It was very much based on amateurs. A CB. Nice. Yeah. And this is an important thing to realize, because there were tens of thousands of kids, for example, building little radio stations. And this was long before the corporations had any clue that there was any money to be made on this. And the reason I like bringing this up is that it's exactly the same thing with the internet. So I'm old enough to be here when the so-called internet was invented. I'm an all-time user, and no one used that thing. There were no such things as .coms, right? For example, when the web first started, they were like, you know, it was all .gov, .edu, .org. Same thing with radio. I mean, the radio was labor unions, it was community organizations, it was churches, it was schools. And I'm going to get back into that when I jump into this sort of short history thing. It was definitely in the hands of amateurs. And so, you know, CB radio and ham radio is really a continuation of that trend. Are you familiar with ham radio? Because ham radio kind of has some overlaps. Ham radio is part of the bandwidth that's reserved for radio amateurs. And there are probably I would say almost every town has a ham radio club in it. And I know a lot of them. Has anyone ever been to the Maker Fair when it was in, so the Maker Fair always have a bunch of ham radio clubs there, and they're glad to sit you down and show you how to work it. It's sort of like a big transmitter, you know, you put an antenna, and you have your own frequency, and people sort of communicate. Ham radio became a big deal during Radio Katrina down in New Orleans area, because cell phone towers were knocked out. Electrical things were knocked out, but the ham radio operators were there. And actually a lot of the communication that took place in the aftermath of the big hurricane was because the ham radios could still communicate. And there's a lot of like isolated parishes that were cut off from water. So, you know, the ham radio phenomenon is actually, it's a pretty cool thing. It's a continuation of the amateur use of the bandwidth. Okay, so I'm sorry. Why is it called ham? You know what? Why is it called ham? This is I think a really interesting thing, because I'm really interested in the origin of words. Nobody knows. No one knows why it's called ham. Even the ham radio. And there's all kinds of theories, but there's no one that will say definitively this is what it means. They think that it has to do, the only possibility is that the really early ones were operated with a telegraph key. And so you had to be like ham-fisted. Like that's one of the reasons that's probably the most common thing I see, but no one knows, which is kind of bizarre. Amateurs. So do you have to be pretty proficient to use it? Well, the amateurs actually, primitive radio was actually not that big a deal. It was pretty easy. Like crystal radio sets. You're probably familiar with that. A lot of kids used to build crystal radio sets. It's pretty simple to pick up a signal from afar, so it wasn't that complicated. Okay, so there are other licensing requirements for these things. You mean like ham? You do need a license for ham. You need an FCC operator license. it's really simple to do. I mean, it's like you can do it online. It's not a big deal. And so I think I got that license. I don't even know. No one even checks anyway. But, and for CB things, you don't need a license for that. But you do. There are some rules you have to follow, such as you have to identify who you are. You have to have certain call letters. But other than that. All right, any other things? Any other quick questions? I'm going to jump into this, back into this, and we'll get back out and go into the more direct pirate stuff. Okay, so let's see here. So this is the spectrum that we refer to. You can see lots of this. Well, this is a hard thing to see. Lots of these spectrums are reserved for the U.S. government, which is kind of interesting. So people interested in eavesdropping, there's a lot of coded information. I don't know if you've ever been, here's a question. Whoops, hold on, I gotta get this out of here. I'm gonna ask you this question. Has anyone ever experimented with scanners, like police scanners or any of that kind of stuff? Or have you ever been out like late at night, listening, like scanning a radio? Just hearing what's out there, like on shortwave or something like that, online scanners. There's a lot of weird stuff out there that you can pick up. Like there's a lot of stations that, and this, no one can really explain what these are. You'll just hear numbers all night long, forever. Numbers, 3, 0, 9, 5, 8, 15, 60. That's it, for hours and hours and hours. And no one can really understand what that is. It's some kind of weird international coding thing that's going on. But anyway, there's a lot of weird number stations, right? It's just strange. But all right, let me go back to this thing. I want to get to the pirate radio thing quick. Okay, so let's see. Here are the spectrum allocations. Okay, now I want to look a little bit at the corporate control of this and why radio has been so locked down. So you may have heard of AT&T, American Telephone and Telegraph Company. Like a lot of times I'll ask people, if their present life has anything to do with Alexander Graham Bell or Marconi, and of course people say, well, of course not. We're in the modern age. But I have to remind them, well, AT&T, which like many of us are paying our bills to, directly comes from them, of course, American Telephone and Telegraph Company. Here is sort of a quick rundown that I'll show you. Let me see if hopefully you don't see that other thing, mechanics. So, just sort of a quick how this sort of meshes into the time grid. I'll just run this thing through here just so you can see some of the time. So you have the telegraph that breaks off to the wireless telegraph. You have the invention of the telephone. The wireless telegraph brings forth regular radio. And of course, radio brings forth sound film, and the radio also brings out television. And then, of course, we can't forget the phonograph, which also feeds into the whole radio industry. So these are some of the, sort of the primary sort of big technological innovations. So I just want to point out this grid because in terms of who owns all this stuff, you can kind of see, like first you have like, the film industry, comes about through the Edison patents, which of course becomes General Electric. The telegraph comes, is brought about through Morse, becomes Western Union. Telephone, Bell has the patents, becomes AT&T. Wireless, Marconi becomes RCA. And of course, the radio industry becomes NBC RCA. And I'm going to let me just show this really quickly. I kind of lay this down in a grid of what's going on in the world. You don't have to, I'm just running this by you really fast just so you can get a sense of sort of the timing of it all. But this is what I want to get to. So when radio first starts to be developed, as I said, it's very much run by amateurs. Now there is one station that gets involved in Pittsburgh, and it's it's not it's KDKA. And what they do, it's owned by Westinghouse. And so Westinghouse is, probably the largest electronics manufacturer back in the day. And they want to sell radios, of course. So what they come up with a brilliant idea is that, we're going to start a radio station. And the reason we're going to start this radio station is to sell radios. And so that's where really the first commercial radio station begins. And so they start having, musical acts on, comedians, essentially vaudeville. And that radio station becomes very popular. And then that's when corporations start to get very interested because, oh, wait a minute, we can use these radio waves to sell things, to manipulate the public. I mean, this is really a time of, the growth of advertising, right? And mass industrialization. So the radio stations start to become, taken over, or the waves start to be taken over by corporations. And I should say that in the middle of World War I, the federal government takes control of all the radio stations because of, well, not for very good reason, but they want to sort of just maintain it for sort of national security purposes. And after the war, the government, through what's called the FCC, or the equivalent of the FCC, starts to give those radio frequencies to corporations. And this is where you sort of see the beginning of monopolization of all electronic media. So this is, in the beginning, there was only the National Broadcasting Company, which was run by RCA. They had two big networks, the red network and the blue network, but they basically had every radio station, every major radio station in the country by 1933. This is, RCA. So here's a little brief overview of RCA. These are the people who come to form RCA, the Marconi interests, General Electric, because General Electric is building transmitters. Marconi, of course, has wireless patents. Westinghouse is selling radios. AT&T are using their long distance lines to connect all these radio stations together to create these networks. United Fruit is a big player. Why is United Fruit interested in radio? Well, down there in their plantations in Central America, they relied upon radio to communicate. I mean, essentially, it was, how to keep their colonial empire together. In fact, if you look at the growth of radio, you'll see it has closely tied with colonialism and imperialism. But these companies create RCA, which creates NBC. So what happens is that NBC is sued essentially and says they're monopolizing. So they sell one of their networks, the blue networks, that becomes ABC. Meanwhile, you have a sort of an upstart, Columbia Records. Of course, they want to sell records, and the best way to sell records is to have radio stations. So they create their own broadcasting system called CBS, right? The Columbia Broadcasting System. So let me get out of here and I just mostly wanted to show you that there is, from the beginning, there was this clearing off of the radio waves, which were dominated by amateurs and by organizations. A great example is KCFL, which is a big clear channel AM radio station in Chicago. Why is it called CFL? Because it was the Chicago Federation of Labor that ran that station. And that was one of the biggest radio stations. And if you notice, all the people kind of joke around when they talk about radio, they say, oh, it's on the left end of the dial. You ever heard that? Well, it's true, because they took all the stations and they shoved them off to the left end of the dial. And they opened up the other frequencies to all the corporate ones. So that's why it's no accident that if you want to look for the student radio station or the NPR station, most places start on the left end of the dial. That's where they are, because they were all shoved off to the side. And of course, by 1934, they had the big Telecommunications Act, and that really sort of sealed the fate of broadcasting that gave the frequencies to these big corporations. Then with World War II, and after World War II, of course, you had the growth of television. Even though TV was invented in the 20s, it didn't really take off to the 50s. And of course, all those frequencies were given to the big three. That's why forever we've had CBS, NBC, ABC, all the way up into the late 60s. PBS comes along, finally, the only fourth really major player. And if you look at the origins of PBS, it's pretty interesting because the groundwork was laid by Lyndon Johnson, who mostly wanted it to have a communication system in the event of martial law. And so for the same reason that the interstate system was created wasn't to get cars around faster. It was so you can move military equipment around the country faster. So the origins of PBS is really interesting. He wanted a good channel in case he had to come on the air and announce that, we're all under martial law. But anyway, it did not have any of these liberal kind of connotations in the beginning. Okay, I'm going to get into the pirates. So does anyone have any questions about any of that? Any questions, comments, complaints about any of that stuff? Okay, so what happens there is radio is pretty much out of the hands of mere mortals, and that goes into the 50s. Now there are some exceptions. The Pacifica Radio Network is an amazing exception. They come along in the 50s, a whole history of that. BAI, KPFA, et cetera. That is really the only exception to the pretty much corporate domination of all the radio waves. And you get into the 60s, and of course, there's a lot of interest in radio. You have the sort of growth of rock and roll. You have the transistor radio, and now you have radios in cars, and so there's a huge cultural pressure for more radio. But it's very much on the AM dial is where everything's, is where the bulk of the listeners are. But there are some people who get some access to FM stations and start doing some experimental stuff, like in the late 60s, for example. And here's also where you see a few pirates, and there are a few sort of, infamous or pirates, but they're mostly AM pirates, people who get in boats with big transmitters and anchor off in international waters and try to beam their signal to the mainland. But they typically don't last long. They get arrested, et cetera, et cetera. But something happens in the late 70s, early 80s, into the 90s. And you have, I'm looking at sort of two big sort of cultural phenomena. One is hip hop, the other is punk rock. And these are sort of cultural, milieus that are really into DIY. They're into low tech. They're into, they're very much against corporate culture. They don't care what the mainstream is doing. They're going to do their own thing, whether it's having, big, DJ vinyl parties on the street, or they're doing, copy and paste zines, or, new places of culture exchange, music, et cetera. So there's a lot of interest in DIY stuff. You also have as part of that DIY culture, you also have a big growth of tech culture, right? There definitely is this kind of a counterculture that comes out of Silicon Valley, the whole Silicon Valley ethos, before it became corporatized. A lot of experimentation. You have a lot of growth in the electronic circuits, different types of circuits that are developed. Electronics gets cheaper and cheaper and cheaper, and more people understand electronics. And you have this kind of period of time when a lot of that kind of merges and meshes. And going into the 80s, you have Reaganism, you have a lot of people who are just sick to death of what's going on, and they want to just kind of, they're going to create their own thing. And that's when you sort of see the growth of some of the pirates. I'm going to talk about and particularly I think one of the main inspirations for the pirate movement is a guy named Mbano Kantako. And he was a radio pirate that we work with, actually. I'm going to show you actually a video clip, if you wouldn't mind. It's like, for a long time, I was part of a group called Paper Tiger Television. I'm actually still a part of that. We've been around now, 40 years or something like that. It's still a collective. We were very involved in pirate radio. I'm going to show you about maybe a 12-minute clip of something we did on pirate radio as a means to promote early pirate radio. So if you have any questions here, if not, I'm going to show you a clip of this, and you can get a sense of what's happening here. Okay, let me go back to my screen. Oh yeah, so this is one of the sort of things that we did through Paper Tiger TV, and we were starting to do sort of promote the idea of what we call low power empowerment. But I'm going to show you this clip here, and then I think this will help explain it more visually.
Once again, it's that time of the day when the station gets truly funky. But right about now I've got something special for you. As I speak, this radio station is taking over the airwaves. Follow for now, and do not attempt to change the channel.
With considerable expense, we introduce
Hotep. My name is Mbana Kantako, and I want to welcome you to Black Liberation Radio. Black Liberation Radio was founded by the John Hay Tenants Rights Association after repeatedly being attacked by the corporate-controlled press. Many issues that the association attempted to address in the early days were met by media attacks, and therefore we sat down and tried to figure out what could we do to stop the media attacks. We couldn't stop the corporate press, so we felt the best thing to do was to enter into the media arena. Newspaper we considered, but it wasn't a viable option because many of our people can't read and write, and comprehension is even another factor that must be considered. So, thus was born Black Liberation Radio.
Basically, our station is one model for doing microwatt radio, and what we're interested in doing is, in coming out of the housing project in Springfield, Illinois, is reaching that community that's directly around us. And we reach about 70% of the Black community in Springfield, just simply because of the fact of housing segregation. So we reach 70% of the community with less than a watt of power. And most of the people who do programming, unlike me, actually live in the projects, and the station is in the house of somebody who was born in the projects. But we do anything from music formats. The show that I do 1 hour a week is an African reggae hip hop mix. We do live mixes on the air. We do talking books, where we have books that are read, and we serialize them over the course of several weeks. We do live interviews on the air with people from the projects. People might walk in the door of Mbana Kantako's house, sit down on the living room couch, and they're on the air, or they might just call in. We do phone interviews with people all around the country. And that's probably our biggest expense in terms of a phone bill. And we're always constantly seeking to allow people's voices to be heard, the unheard voices, either because they don't have access to the airwaves in the community, or because they're so far away from the community that they wouldn't be part of the dialogue that goes on in the community unless we brought them in for telephone interviews.
My involvement started with Mbana in 1987, right after March 30th, when a Black 32-year-old man had been beaten to death in public in front of 100 people by 11 police officers. And it was never nothing done about it. I got involved with Mbana when he staged a protest march against the murder.
We basically have a police scanner. And so we're capable of hearing what the police say to one another. And we know their code, we know their language, so we can identify where they are in the community at any given time and what their plans are. So we just open that up to people, and people get to listen to police broadcasts, which are intended only for the police. But we then make them public as a way of letting people in the community know that essentially the police at the John Hay Homes housing project are an army of occupation. And given the fact that they operate that way, we feel it's important to let people know what they're up to.
Since we came on the air November 25th, 1986, and went relatively unknown until March 1989. In March of 1989, a series of police brutality cases came to our attention here at the station, and we attempted to cover them. In the final case, we call it the Gregory Court Massacre, where 3 of our people were killed by a death squad of police, masked men with weapons, automatic rifles, flak jackets, jumpsuits, dressed for a war. We covered that story, and that's when the chief of police at the time filed a complaint with the FCC. He claimed that some people had called him and told him that we were cussing on the radio.
FCC, the Federal Communications Commission, has fined the radio station $750 and ordered that it cease and desist broadcasting. We've not paid the fine, and we have continued to broadcast. So we're in violation of the administrative regulations of the FCC. Now, legally, they consider us an illegal station for that reason, and they would like us to cease and desist. So in arguing that we want access to the airwaves, what essentially we're arguing about is issues of free speech, which in this case include the right to speech on the radio, issues that have to do with access to the airwaves and economic discrimination, and that has a racial edge to it as well in the case of poor people who, in the case of our radio station, happen to be African American, in that they don't have access to the airwaves. As Mbana says, when the Federal Communications Act of 1934 was written, his people were sitting in the back of the bus.
We've been met with different responses by the government, ranging from a bullet being shot through the window to my 9-year-old son being kidnapped from the public schools, my wife being harassed every time she goes to the store, to consistent threats of eviction by the local housing authority.
I want the system to know that he's not alone. You know, some of the people was able to put fear into them because of their jobs or their life, or the kids were being harassed in school. But, you know, some people are born to do certain things, and he's just one of those people. And I'm just one of those people that will assist him in doing what he's doing. And that's about the bottom line of what the radio station is all about. And Mbana is about justice, and he's a voice that is crying out for his people.
Welcome to the bottom of the American dream, or as we call it out here in the project, the American nightmare. We are gathered here today, not in fear or trembling of our impending arrest, but in rare celebration. Victory, common people, over a repressive political corporate power structure. We are gathered here to celebrate a victory of brain power over firepower. We are gathered here to celebrate a victory of creativity over destruction, imagination over regimentation, David over Goliath, hope over fear, and considering the fact that an African-American man is killed by the police every 34 hours, we can even celebrate a victory of life over the threat of death. Let us remember the story of this victory so that we can pass it on to our children as a humble inspiration to them to carry on the struggle for freedom. Somebody tells them of the day that it took an Afro-Saxon from Washington and 5 white policemen to shut down a 1-watt radio station being operated by an unarmed blind man. Somebody tells them how the pulse of WTRA, 1 watt of truth, has overpowered the 50,000 megawatts of establishment propaganda for over 16 months. Somebody tell the children how WTRA served as an advocate for the people when the police wouldn't police themselves. Somebody tell our teenagers how we challenged the police death squad that killed our people behind masks and attempts to intimidate our neighborhood. Somebody tell the young people how we fought police brutality by broadcasting personal testimony of African-American victims. Somebody tell them how we trained 9-year-olds, 13-year-olds, 15-year-olds to do live radio with confidence that they would carry on the struggle for freedom for the rest of their lives.
So you're tired of what's going on local radio, getting the same old bullshit from the same old press people that come out, listen to your story and don't tell the truth. We got an answer for you here in Springfield. It's called, we can't call it clandestine radio, we can't call it pirate radio. We call it liberation radio. Welcome to Zoom Black Magic. We use this is our transmitter. Purchased from a catalog we got from Pan Access out in California. $150. With this, and what else I'm about to show you, you can go on there yourself. Very simple, basic design on the back. You have a cord that goes into the wall. You have 2 input jacks, left and right channel, so you can play stereo. And you have your antenna.
Okay. But the other parts you need just to go on the air are these. Stereo compressor. This is simply just like an electronic equalizer. It's more or less like an equalizer for transmission. Mostly you got an equalizer in your home, on your home stereo, or your car stereo. Your mixer doesn't have to look like that, okay? You can want it Radio Shack or any other place. But we got this one, I don't know, because maybe we thought this would help. And it does help. Everything that you want to go on the air comes through here first, okay? Everything. Your cassettes, your turntables, your CDs, or whatever you choose to use, your microphones, everything goes here.
That's why there's so many plugs on the back.
That's right. That's why there's so many plugs. We use a JVC cassette dual simultaneous play, cassette player. JVC. They were real cheap. We got it for $169, and God knows how many hours they've played. This is probably the first time this one's been off for God knows how long. Simple, simultaneous play. Why you want simultaneous play? Because you want to be able to mix. You want to bring your one song in over the other song. So simultaneous play is essential. We have an antenna here. This is one of the first things you connect. This runs around, as you can see, runs around the wall, through the wall, out, and up onto the roof. The pin on the end of this antenna wire goes into this particular piece right here. You insert it, I can find it, I got it, and you tighten it up. We start here with this. We go to the mixer. We go to the compressor, which is the top box here, the little box underneath the mixer. Then we go to the transmitter, we go to the antenna, and then we go to the roof, and then we come in your home.
When you get this stuff hooked up, does the transmitter come already tuned into some particular frequency? Or?
No. You have to find, what you have to do is you have to take your regular receiver like we got down here, radio, and scan the dial. Look for a blank space. That's all you do.
Now, when you get your transmitter and you find this blank space, do you then have to get somebody that knows a little bit about electronics and open up that transmitter and set it to this 107.1 or whatever it is?
That's right. And your antenna needs to be cut to a certain height as well, too. You know, the different pieces of your antenna needs to be cut in order to match up, okay, with the transmitter.
Okay. Why don't we do that in another show?
Well, yeah.
You don't want to give it all away at the first one.
That's right. We might not want another one.
Okay, so I'm going to stop it there for a second. I want to show you something else again here also, but it just kind of gives you an example of what we're talking about. So the case of Mbano Kantako was really an inspiration for a lot of us who are interested in these kinds of radio issues, and in particular the notion of micro broadcasting. And that shift, I think, is a big thing to consider, because previously radio pirates were interested in hitting the biggest market that you could, right? You wanted to blast a city, right? Because that's the cool thing. But the whole notion, particularly around Mbano's case, totally changed. It's like, this is really about micro broadcasting. You're not trying to reach a mass audience. You're trying to focus on a smaller group of people. So in Mbano's case, he's only interested in the people in the projects, right? But he did a lot of penetration into that thing. It was a very popular station in the project. And I think I hope you got out of his explanation, during the afternoon, he would have kids come over and read kids' stories, so kids in the projects could listen. And at night, they would turn on the police scanner and just broadcast that, so police could actually listen. I mean, people in the projects could listen to what the police were doing. Of course, that's one of the reasons why he was rated so much and feared by the police. I'm going to show you another very sort of quick example of a different kind of mode of that. If I could let me just go back to sharing my screen here for a second here. It gives you another kind of clue of how this thing works. Let me see here. I think I'm going to go to the actual video itself. It'll be quicker to cue it up. So just jumping ahead to a whole other situation. This is a pirate station in Ireland, and this is a women's station. This is like a housewife station.
Margaret does all the setting up and does all those changes. She regulates the whole thing. But we have a great chat here. Bit of fun and talk and poetry. Somebody comes and sings. And and I say a bit of poetry, Honor sings, and I talk, she talks about the union, trade union. It could be anything. It's a kind of a situation where basically it's like the neighbor dropping in.
And so that we were thinking about how did we really enjoy ourselves and how we enjoyed ourselves as women. And this is in relation to the fact that a lot of women are at home, a lot of women have children. Women really enjoy more of a social occasion. We've got a whole lot of women bringing stories and songs and whatever have you. And from then it came to the idea of the radio, that more women listen to the radio. And yet, no radio, there was no such thing as women's radio. So I went back to Galway and I started something Galway Women's Entertainment. And also the idea is that because of women's, you know, there's so many commitments in the home, and if they're working, that they don't really have time to be able to have a kind of regular meeting once a week or whatever have you. So it was the idea of gathering women 4 times a year. And out of that then came the radio. So we put in a license as a kind of neighborhood for women.
Hold on, let's stop there.
The whole relationship of language and women in this country. You have James Joyce, you've Bernard Shaw, you've got Casey.
Sorry, I'm trying to find that.
And the language basically comes from within the home and from the woman. And this has never, ever been recognized. And the stories, and also in Galway, because we have the Irish and the English, you know, so the whole richness of the language. So put in a license based on the richness and on the endorsement and appreciation.
Can't find my thing here. Hold on a second.
So with everyone else, no one has had these licenses. After a year then is that we said, hell with that. You want us, you know, you're quite willing for us to open our purse.
Okay, sorry about that. So I just wanted to show you that this is another example of micro broadcasting, right? This is a community in Galway that was started essentially by the women of the neighborhood, because, you know, they're all isolated in their homes, they're housewives, and they're taking care of their kids, sending the kids off to school. So what they did was they started a micro radio station, and then they would invite the women over and from the neighborhood to come over and talk about stuff that's going on in their lives, things in the neighborhood. So it's another kind of example of, you know, of micro radio. So anyone have any questions about any of that stuff I showed you before I go on to sort of how it emerges in terms of low power FM? Yeah, go ahead. Just jump in.
Oh, awesome. Thank you. That overview was like so interesting. Thank you. I think so many of these stories, right to the point of Anuj, that like maybe we need to displace the image a little bit because of the role that the image plays in our media. Because sound stories are not stories that I know. And it was interesting to watch it alongside my friend May. We've been talking a little bit of, as movies have been going, about the Syrian local radio stations that we know and the function that they played in like protecting communities from bombing raids and signaling kind of new kinds of conversations that were emergent. So I'm wondering if I could ask a comparative question and say, like, is there something particular about American radio as distinct from these transnational forms of radio that I know? And if we're thinking about radio here in this current place, is there something particular about, I don't know, like, maybe that's my question, like putting the American story in a larger global context.
So radio, when you mean radio, you mean in terms of commercial radio, or you're talking about like differences in alternative pirate radio?
Oh, all pirate. All
pirate. I think there's a lot of similarities, frankly. I mean, and that's actually one of the things I was gonna talk about, sort of where some of the ideas for this micro radio came from this guy Tetsuo Kagawa, who's Japanese. I'm going to show you some of his stuff. Also, a lot of it came out of the of Europe, of the pirate stations in France and in Italy. I think being involved in pirate radio for a long time, I've had a lot of connection with pirate radio operators around the world, and there is a kind of a common culture around it. There is a kind of common aesthetic that's kind of interesting, that you feel very much at home with other people who are doing pirate radio. I don't know how to describe it other than that, but there's some of the things, there's like, they're more slower. It's more like, you know, you're not so afraid of having dead space. People joke that it's okay to flush a toilet when you're on pirate radio. There's like sounds of the home, and there's a certain kind of aesthetic. I haven't really thought about it that much because it really is an international movement. I don't know if that answers your question at all, but I'm going to go and show you just quick other things. So what happens in like the late 80s? Mbano is like in the you know, mid to late 80s, and pirate radio. Some of us start to get really interested in this, and there's a guy named Tetsuo Kogawa, and he was actually he was involved in pirate radio in France and then Italy, in the whole you know, autonomous movement that was going on in there. And he sort of brought a lot of pirate stuff to Japan, and he built a whole series of micro radio stations in Japan, also illegally. But he was sort of interesting because he was very much interested in promoting the idea of people building their own technology. Right, like Mbano ordered a transmitter, but Tetsuo wanted to really demystify the technology, and that's where he connected with our group, my group, Paper Tiger TV, because that's one of our things, is that we demystify technology. We want people to understand the technology, and you can do that by building things on your own. So as you saw, like Mbano is trying to like demystify the technology, sort of explain, well, this is a box, it does this, it's just like your equalizer, you know, this is not a big deal, has a lot of inputs in it, that's just because you can plug all these things into it. So Tetsuo comes to the United States, and actually he has a workshop at my house, actually, and we built a radio station that night called KXXX, Mission District Radio. And after that meeting, he trained me on how to build transmitters, and and so our group started to do a lot of workshops about how to build your own transmitter from scratch, and we made videotapes about how to do that, and we did workshops all over the place. So this was really part of the burgeoning of pirate stations in the late 80s and early 90s, and by the time it was like, I don't know, like 92 or something, the FCC estimated there were about 3,000 pirates operating in the United States. So it was like a big threat to the FCC. And one of the people who came out of my workshop was Radio Free Berkeley, or Free Radio Berkeley. A guy named Stephen Duniford came to one of my workshops, and he launched Free Radio Berkeley. And Free Radio Berkeley was a big case because the FCC actually showed up at his door, shut him down, and sued him. And so there was a committee out of the National Lawyers Guild called the Committee for Democratic Communications that took up his case. And I was on that committee. We tried to pick up Mbano's case, but it was just too complicated. There were some other things involved there, so that did not become the case. But Free Radio Berkeley became the case that went to the courts. Oh yeah, so someone says Stephen has been helping me. Well, if you see Stephen, tell him I said hello. He's an old friend of mine. So anyway, he was raided by the police, and Stephen was running Free Radio Berkeley. He was really hitting a lot of Berkeley. He had a pretty powerful transmitter. And he would for a while, he was putting his transmitter on his backpack with a car battery and going up in the hills of Berkeley and transmitting from there and moving around. And after a while, he just said, screw it. And he's just going to do it out of his house, in which, of course, they were able to find him. But he was doing workshops also. And as far as I know, he's still doing them. I haven't seen him for a while. But so this sort of pirate movement became really big. And a lot of people were building these things. So the FCC was very sort of upset, tried to shut them down. The Committee for Democratic Communications countersued the FCC with the language that your ability to broadcast in the electronic age is the equivalent of publishing a pamphlet. And so it's a freedom of speech issue. And that opinion actually won over I forget the judge, but the judge was impressed by that logic and told the FCC, oh, well, you should actually negotiate with these people. Because we were arguing that there's plenty of space on the bandwidth. And it's all bullshit that they tell us they can't come here. They'd say the things like, oh, it's going to interfere with airplanes and all that. They were just throwing every time-worn argument, which are all false. And so basically, the FCC actually came around and said, okay, we will support opening up these frequencies. right? So it was like, wow. I mean, they were like, we're going to legalize pirates. And so at that point, the National Association of Broadcasters got involved. The NAB is the sort of the corporate arm of all the big corporate stations. And they threw a fit. I mean, the NAB, when the FCC it said, we're going to, legalize these stations, the big commercial stations hit the roof. And so they really hit Congress hard with lobbying, et cetera, et cetera. So there was lots and lots of fighting going on. Eventually, they would pass a bill called the Radio Broadcasting Preservation Act of 2000. And what that did, we kind of called it the Broadcast Industry Preservation Act, right? Because it was really it was very watered down. And one of the things that it did, which was interesting, was that it said, okay, we're gonna open up a lot of these frequencies, but none of them are going to be in urban areas, which was like mind-blowing. Like, what? So we really felt stabbed in the back, because here's sort of the title of my talk: Urban Pirates to Rural Radio. All of the pirates were essentially in urban areas, right? So they said, okay, well, we're going to give you your stations, but none of them are going to be in the big markets. Of course, that's why it was the Broadcast Preservation Act, because that's, of course, what the big broadcasters didn't want. They didn't want any competition in San Francisco or New York or Los Angeles, right? So they said, well, they can have the backwoods. And so LPFM, low power FM, as it's called now, was launched. These initial waves went out of you could apply for licenses, but only in rural areas. And so as a result, I think it was a really interesting kind of effect, because suddenly you had people coming out of the woodwork in a lot of rural areas, and instead of saying, yeah, we can have our own radio station here. And so I'm sort of pulling some of this from a recent paper that I wrote about looking at rural radio stations. And in a lot of ways, it really made a huge impact, maybe even a bigger impact than it would have in the urban areas, because a lot of rural areas don't have access to media. They really lack, a sort of a civic culture. And so radio stations were actually a really important, for many of these small towns, a really important means of keeping the community together. And it actually is in the spirit of micro broadcasting, right? Maybe you're not looking for the city. Maybe you're not trying to reach everyone in Berkeley, but maybe you're reaching a small group. And so just in terms of looking at some of these rural areas, I've been sort of looking at that, and I'll sort of show you how you can too. I kind of picked a few local stations here. And I know Olivia is familiar with some of these. KPCA is, for example, is in Petaluma, California, a community of 60,000 in Napa Valley. They're run by a community TV access station. They sort of form a sort of community purpose. They have a lot of people coming in and do radio shows, they do local news programs, et cetera, et cetera. And this is in an environment where you probably know local news is dead. I mean, it's local news. I mean, the irony to me about the internet is you probably know more about what's going on in like China than you do down the street. This is local media. This is so few places to tap into local media. Or there's KLLG in Willits, California. It's a population of 5,000 people. That's a small town. They have their own LPFM station. Or they have KNYO in Fort Bragg, population 8,000 people. This is created by a sort of community organization. And there's one in Georgetown, California. Georgetown, the population of Georgetown is 300. I mean, that's a small town. And they specialize in folk music. That's kind of what their mission is. Let's see. So yeah, I mean, so that's one of the interesting things about it. And so now there are, I don't forget, I've kind of lost track of the count. I'm going to show you some resources about how you can keep up with that. But there's about 3,000 low power FM stations across the United States. And I would say most of them are in rural areas. Now, there was some fighting back in terms of the legislation, and there was a new piece of legislation that was passed in 2011 called the Local Community Radio Act. And that actually did legalize more of opened up some of the frequencies in the urban areas to LPFM. So a lot of the energy of the pirates went into LPFM, which is a kind of an interesting thing. Although initially a lot of them, were kind of left out because they were couldn't operate in their urban areas. Some of them still continued, but a lot of the energy went into starting LPFM stations. So the way LPFM operates is the FCC sort of announces that there's some frequencies opening up, and you go there and you simply apply and you just follow the footsteps. So there have been a couple of different organizations, like one's called Prometheus, you might be familiar with that, or there's a couple of others that that will work with you to get one of those licenses. And the competition to these licenses is kind of right-wing Christian churches. So if you look at who's getting these frequencies, it's kind of weird, because you'll see, and I'll show you in a minute now, you'll see like a community organization trying to get the frequency, and then sometimes they lose out, and it's like the Calvary Baptist Church. Yeah, and so that's why if you drive around in the valley, for example, where you can get a lot of radio stations, if you like skim the dial, you'll hit on a lot of like these weird mix of Christian stations. A lot of it's because of LPFM, because they're tuned in. They, like us, are like, they want to get these stations. But it's really interesting who are the groups that will grab a station. Like one particular station, which I can't remember the call letters for it. Let me see what it is. It's I think it's, let me see, I have it written down somewhere. It's KPCN. That is a station of pineros, of loggers in a small agricultural town in Oregon. It's a Spanish language station. It's essentially a station run for farm workers, by farm workers, and it's mostly in Spanish. It's one of the advantages of micro broadcasting is that, it's really great for languages like Mixtec and other languages that are, you're not going to really hear in big radio stations, but there are sizable communities that speak that. In Ireland, also there's a lot of Irish language stations, which is kind of interesting also. It's, in a lot of ways, it's kind of a way to keep language alive. I'm going to sort of, I'm going to show you one other, so I'm going to rush through a few other things, and then I'm going to come back here and we're going to discuss here. I'm going to ask some questions, but let me get to this, if I can find my keynote again real quick, just to kind of wrap up this part. Let's see, where was I here? Yeah, so get out of there. Whoops. Okay, so these are just some of the sort of publications that were coming out, like build your own radio station, just to sort of get a sense of the flavor of like, this was a big thing in the early 90s. Build your own radio station, look at pirate radio. This is an article on the KXXX. This is Tetsuo Kagawa. This is a schematic that we built. This article was written by me, actually. This is a front page article in the Bay Guardian, which I think really promoted pirate radio pretty heavily in the Bay Area. Now this is a class that I teach. I teach it at the LPFM station here in Davis. This is a really sort of great way of like bringing students into the community and doing radio, because radio is, I think, a really fun medium to work on. So these are some of the, this is just kind of a copy and paste of some of the stations that are operating today, LPFM stations in California. I'm going to show you a live feed for that, though, in a second. That'd be better. Let me get out of this. Let me get out of this stop share thing. So yeah, at this point, I'm interested in, if you have any particular questions up to now, because I think what I'm going to talk just a little bit about is how you can actually do the research right now. If you're interested in building your own radio station, for example. Oh, I can show you one other sort of thing here. I'm going to turn this webcam thing on. These are actually, these are actually transmitters that built from scratch. This is actually the transmitter that was used for KXXX in the mission. So as you can see, we would do these workshops where we would put the components on the table, and we'd gather people around. We'd get like beer and burritos or something, and then we'd have a soldering iron, and then I'd give out one of these metal plates, put a few soldering irons around, put the schematic up, and just do step by step how to solder these things together. And then so this is actually probably a 10-watt transmitter here, and then I sort of show people how you you know, you connect, what part you connect to the antenna, what part you connect to sort of like the output of your you know, cassette player or your MP3 player or whatever. So it's part of the demystifying of it, is like building these transmitters yourself. And I mean, cost-wise, it's like $20, you know, so it's not expensive at all. Let's see here. Yeah, so any questions about that before I show you some of the current stuff? I'm curious, does anyone have any, I mean, are you actually interested in developing a station? Maybe? Susanna?
I'm curious if there's like a network of people who already have these like systems set up where you could just like join on when they're not using the system.
That's a good question. So that would be like, so that would be my recommendation. So what happens is a lot of times, I'll give you an example, Chico, California. There was a frequency that came up in Chico. So you want to grab that frequency, right? You don't want the Calvary Church to get it or some other group, right? So it's like what some of these groups do is like find a community organization that could use a voice, right? And you approach them and say, hey, there is a frequency opening up here. Wouldn't it be amazing, the Chico Peace and Justice Center, for example, to have your own radio station, right? And then you sort of say, why don't you apply for this, right? And so there are ways to apply for your own station. And there's a list of points that give you, that help to elevate you above the list, because you have to make the case that like you're like together, you're an organization, and you kind of know what you're doing, and then you get the frequency. But let's just say someone gets a frequency. Now, not legally, but one of the arguments that you make is that you have to be a local origination station, which means that you're not just going to play pre-recorded junk, right? You're going to actually have real people come into the radio station and get on the air and play stuff. That's where the Calvary people fall down, because they don't do that. What they do is they have their pre-recorded stuff and they just sort of, you know, farm it over to there. They don't really have, it's not an active station, right? So the stations that do have licenses, they very much want public participation. So the first thing I would do is look to see if there actually is an LPFM station and connect with them, because chances are what they're interested in is like maybe 2 hours a day or 1 hour a day or whatever. Most of these stations have plenty of open slots that they could give you. So let's say that you wanted to do a particular show, right? You wanted to cover a particular whatever topic, or you could find a station that already is there and just pitch it to them. That's a lot easier than starting a whole station by yourself. But you know, it's not that hard to start either. I mean, I was very involved in starting KDRT. I mean, we built that from scratch, did the licensing, you know, put up the antenna, you know, organized the whole thing. Yeah, those are two possibilities. And you don't know when the licenses are up. I'm going to show you how to find out when the licenses are up. Does that answer your question?
Yes, thank you.
Yeah. Any other questions? Yes.
I have a somewhat like really, this was a question I wanted to ask in terms of technical things before.
Yeah, sure.
So there's an interest, I think, in like micro broadcasting, like in Arabic, for example.
Yeah.
In the local refugee community. But then there's also really interesting connections like along the West Coast between like refugee populations who speak Arabic who would also like to integrate into that kind of you know, radio network. So is there a way to combine like micro broadcasting at like local levels like in this region and also with like LA or San Diego and Vancouver, for example?
Absolutely. I mean, there are certainly ways to do that. I mean, the question would be if you wanted to do that live or not. I mean, many local radio programs become syndicated. I mean, that's how you become syndicated. And the nice thing about this is like, you can think, okay, like KDRT here in Davis, right? Anyone in Davis can tune into KDRT and hear it live, but it's also a podcast also, right? So you could download that every program whenever you wanted to. Also, it's streamed live, right? So that's a really powerful and very cheap means of connecting these shows together. So yeah, if you wanted to have like an Arab language station or a show, it would be really easy to link all those together. I mean, yeah, you could either, you know, those other stations could pick up that podcast and play that podcast back, or even you can connect it live on the internet through like call-ins and things like that. It'd be an easy thing to do, and in fact, people do that. Yeah. So one strategy, I'm just going to see, get a phone number broadcast. Yeah. Okay. Yeah. Someone, Olivia posted a thing about the Punjabi stations. Yeah. Yeah. I mean, simple in a lot of ways, you know, and interesting in terms of the use of media. It's really has not fallen that far. I mean, you would look at, like, you know, obviously newspapers are really up against it, but radio is still a popular thing mostly because of our car culture. You know, people are stuck in cars, and psychologically, you know, it's great to listen to your own music, right? Your MP3s, but psychologically, there's something about a human voice that's out there that's very appealing to people. You know, it's very comforting to know that, oh yeah, there's a real person out there talking to me and sort of sharing things, information, you know, whether it's weather or traffic or whatever. It's very soothing in a lot of ways. So the medium of radio, I think, is still very, very viable, particularly around the question of language, obviously, because, you know, we're in such an English-dominated culture, and there's so many different languages spoken, and to be able to hear a station in your own show in your own language is incredible, really, for a lot of people. It's very empowering. So any other questions? I'm gonna just show you sort of a resource here. Let me sort of just find this thing quickly. Let's see, history, launch. Let me see this. Okay, I'm gonna go back to my screen here for quick. Can you all see that, I'm assuming? Okay, so this is a really great, there's a bunch of good resources. This is a pretty phenomenal resource, I think. I think it's one of the best ones. So this is like all the information you'd care to know about LPFM, what's happening with LPFM. So here at the top here, you know, randomly selected LPFM stations you can check out. But here's, like, if you want to see if there's a station in your area, right, you just go to this section, plug it in here. If you want to have, if you have an LPFM station and need assistance, you can go there. Current, you know, all the information about every other station that's out there, all kinds of great tools. Let me see, there's something else I was gonna show you here. Maybe it's to search. So let's just say if you put in Davis, California, let's see what comes up. Search FCC data. Let's see, 95616. It's thinking. Okay, well, it's giving me everything around here, including Davis. So this, for example, I mean, the FCC has pretty good records of stuff. I mean, you can go and you see just an amazing amount of information. So let's see here. I can't even. I could have put in directly KDRT, but these are all the different stations. So, like, even in Sacramento, there's a bunch of new LPFM stations in Sacramento, and I know that see them all listed here. Like, let's see who owns this one here. I'm just going to click on one randomly. Oh, so the French Cultural Society owns KZAC, Low Power FM in Sacramento. I mean, so that's interesting. I actually remember when they launched that. I think they have a lot of French language in it. Let me see if there's another one. There's another one that started in West Sacramento. Now, if you look through these, you can see it kind of says what they are. So if it's a translator, it just means that it's pushing, you know, it's just forwarding other stations, which is kind of a waste. If it says full service, then it means that that's a real operating radio station. You know, a booster is something is just, again, giving it a little sort of push. Here's some little radio stations. Let's see this one in Stockton. Let's see what that one is. Eternal Life Radio. Okay, so there you go. There you got like a religious station. They grabbed the one in Stockton. Bummer. But anyway. Yeah, okay, the Radio Garden app lets you listen to radio stations around the world. Yeah, this resource that I posted here, RecNet, that also you can listen to the feed. All the feeds come in here too. So it's pretty interesting actually to jump around. Oh, you have a kitty, Olivia. Anyway, okay, just found Oakland, LPFM. Yeah, Poor People's Revolutionary Radio. Yeah, Poor People's Radio. Yeah, I knew about that one. Also, you know, I have to say, there still are pirates. I mean, it's still useful to have a transmitter. And who was it? Was Rob, you were the saying that you had it in the car, correct?
Yeah.
Yeah.
I got a 30-watt kit on eBay. It's pretty good.
Yeah, and so that is, you know, to have an impromptu station like that also is valuable. Also, like for an event, you know. Like Burning Man, which I've never been, but a friend of mine runs the Burning Man radio station. Right? He goes up there and they have a radio station that's operating only for Burning Man, right? He gets up there, sets there, he can interview, play music, etc. Let people, give people news and information and whatever, you know. Food Not Bombs, Keith McHenry, I don't know if you're familiar with Food Not Bombs, but they used to have radio stations too. When they would set up their Food Not Bombs, they would also bring along a transmitter and they'd transmit stuff about Food Not Bombs and what kind of beans they were serving that day or something like that. I don't know. But having a radio station, though, I think is a really interesting communal experience to run a radio station. And when I teach radio production here for students, and they really enjoy it, I think, in terms of, you know, sitting around in this radio station, sharing microphones and just having a conversation about things is really, I don't know, there's something really great about it. I mean, in a lot of ways, I've produced a lot of TV programs too, and radio is so much more, I don't know, smarter in a certain way. I don't know what it is, because TV, you're so obsessed with the look of it and the sort of the tech of it. But when you're doing a radio show, you can really kind of like let that drift a little bit, you know. But anyway, any questions about any of this stuff? That's kind of like what I was going to throw out there, and I'd be happy to answer any other things people have. Anyone in the Bay Area wants to transmit? Oh yeah, I'd be curious to know where exactly did you got your transmitter on eBay?
Yeah, so I had a 7-watt, and that was fine for like half a block or like one block in the city where there's a lot of buildings. And tonight at 6 p.m. there's another rally. He's going to first test with a 30-watt. I just have a quarter wave antenna on the roof of the car, and we use it we have chants, like we pre-record chanting with both a call and a response, like with me and my roommates. So people in the cars can chant along. We use everyone's car as like a distributed sound system, so everyone rolls down their windows and turns their stereo as loud as they can stand. I have wireless microphones that I spray with alcohol, so we can give those to people near my car so they can transmit. And then the most important thing is to have a PA system that's really, really loud on the same channel, just because, I mean, even at people in person, like typical rallies, the sound is always the issue where people far away can't hear, but with cars being so large and logistics being so difficult, it's really made a big difference for these demos, for things like canceling rent, canceling utilities, ensuring that unhoused people get access to hotel rooms, ensuring that bailout money goes to working class people, leftist issues about COVID justice.
Yeah, I was also thinking of sort of reviving the drive-in movie theater, and you can do that, you know, if you have a video projector and you project, and then you transmit the audio portion on your transmitter, and people can listen to the sound in their cars or with little radios they have or whatever. You know? So it's a good means of sort of decentralizing the audio portion, so you don't have to have a big powerful amplifier, you know. Anyway, I don't know if
I think Katie has a question.
Okay.
Yeah, so what I guess, like, what is preventing someone from just co-opting one of these frequencies, like does the person who owns the frequency just report that to the FCC and then there's some follow-up there? Or I'm trying to understand how it's regulated.
What do you mean? I'm not sure what you mean by that. Like
if you try to transmit at a frequency that you're not registered for?
Yeah. Oh, you mean if someone else was trying to steal your frequency?
Yeah.
I see. So, yeah, well, that would be the FCC.
Okay.
You know? I actually have never had that. I mean, the way frequencies, the way broadcasting works is the more powerful signal will wipe out the other signal. You usually, it's not a question of mixing. You won't hear both. It's either one or the other. So, like, let's just say you had 95.7 FM. If someone else came in with 95.7 FM and they had like twice the wattage you had, that would wipe your station out. They wouldn't be able to get into your frequency. They wouldn't be able to, like, you wouldn't hear their voice like pop up, you know. They couldn't like Zoom bomb the thing, you know. Yeah. They could jam your frequency, but they couldn't sort of come inside of your talk show or whatever or pop up. That's not the way it works. But
can you trace where it's coming from?
Well, it's hard. That's, you know, one of the advantages of it for pirates is that they have to triangulate. They have to have FCC vans out there that have to circle around and around and around. And we used to see them when they would come looking for us. You'd see the white FCC van driving around, trying to locate, you know, trying to triangulate where the system is. So it's not easy to do that. I actually have never heard of anyone jamming a pirate station. I've never heard of, or an LPFM for that matter. It's an interesting question. Yeah. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, thank you.
Yeah.
I have a question.
Yeah.
Do you, Jesse, or does anyone here have experience broadcasting into prisons, doing prison radio in particular?
Well, that's actually a really interesting question. Actually, I meant to bring that up. So the reason why the National Lawyers Guild got involved, the Committee for Democratic Communications, and why we actually brought Tetsuko Gawa to San Francisco to build that thing is because we wanted to build a radio station for San Quentin. That's actually the original reason why we did that. And so there were a couple of lawyers in the Lawyers Guild who actually approached me. They said, could you build us a transmitter? Because they wanted to have a transmitter in the hills above San Quentin. You know, because San Quentin sticks out in the water there for prisoners, because prisoners frequently have access to radios. We actually never got around to doing that for various reasons. So that is an idea that a lot of people have tossed around. I don't know if it's actually ever been done. Olivia, do you have something to say about that?
Yeah, the state prisons, they have their own channel. They have I don't know exactly how they do it, but I know some radio stations that do produce content for the internal radio broadcast. I'm not sure how people are listening to that, whether it's in common places, but there's a station in Whitesburg, Kentucky that because telephone fees are so expensive to call in and call out, they do this thing where they know a lot of prisoners have contraband radio. So they will do a call-in show for families to give messages to folks who are inside. And it's like it happens every week. So if you have a contraband radio, you know, you tune in from this hour to that hour and you can hear messages from your family. But I know that the state prisons do internal system, and some public broadcasters collaborate with them.
Yeah, I know. So a student that I work with does radio in the prisons, but it's more like a show that's put together by prisoners, and then they bring that material out, and then you can hear that on some of the community stations. I think like KPOO in San Francisco, I think broadcasts some of that. But what this was going to be was going to be a station that was transmitting information that would have been blocked by the administration. As you know, a lot of like material is banned from prisons. So I mean, they had ideas of like reading the prison letters of George Jackson, having lawyers out there to answer questions and like civil rights attorneys to sort of broadcast information. That was kind of like the initial idea. It's a great idea. I'm not sure how long it would last before you got busted for that. So it's an interesting thing to think about. Maybe if you had a boat out in the water out by San Quentin, that might do it. But
actual pirates.
Yeah, right. You can get the hats and everything. It would make for great television, right? When they raided you. Yeah. Oh, okay. Someone says last Saturday there's an action in San Quentin with transmission. Interesting. I wonder who did that. Oh, Ear Hustle, right? Ear Hustle is one of the things I was thinking about. Yeah.
I can introduce you to the person who did it. He was another guy with a eBay kit. And it was just for it was a car action, but I don't think they made any efforts to make the incarcerated people aware of the transmission. Are they always contraband?
No, I think some of them are. I think people are allowed to have them. Actually, it depends. I think, but I mean, at least back when I was working with the Lawyers Guild, that they said that like many prisoners had radios. So yeah.
An extent to which that undermines the phone system that they get paid for.
Right. And they don't like to have information coming in that they don't have, access to block if they want to. It's, yes.
We had a lovely workshop last week called Abolitionist UC, in which we started to vision a process of, movement building that focused on abolition as a theoretical frame. And it occurred to me as we're talking about the need of radios in prisons, that an alternative question could be, what about the school systems? And what about, the university as such? And I'm wondering if maybe at the end of this talk, we could return to your work as an organizer within UC faculty and at Davis in particular, and thinking about like UC organizing and the problem of communication. Like it's so hard to talk to people and it's so hard to connect, and it seems to me to be the quintessential problem that we're facing. So how does radio help us?
Yeah, well, that's a good question. And to me, I mean, as a faculty organizer, essentially, it's tough. I'm not sure how radio can help that. I think, well, one of the things is Davis is very fortunate to have its own radio station. I mean, KDVS is, a great resource that should be taken more advantage of. KDVS has a very strong signal, especially for a college radio station. And if you look at the KUSF example, which was the other primary large-scale radio station run by a college, that was shut down and sold. And I always in the back of my mind, I think that UC is just looking at KDVS because they could sell that station for quite a lot of money. So anyway, I mean, there's no reason to create a radio station out of scratch if you already have a powerful radio station. So it could be, and it's easy to get a slot there. It could be that a group of people in Davis could put together a collective and say, we're going to have a radio station that's about organizing the UC campus and publicize that and bring people on to talk about things and have more of an outreach. The question of organizing in communications has been driving me nuts, actually. And unfortunately, a lot of it has to do with, the social strata of, for me, professors, which just drives me up the wall. I mean, so there's a certain attitude of, oh, well, I don't really need to be organized. And there's a lot of like rhetoric about, people should get organized, but faculty are not organized themselves. That's one of the sort of things that I'm up against. I mean, there's a lot of so-called progressive professors here that are not in the faculty association. Like, why the hell are you not in the faculty? I mean, who would be in a workplace where there's a active organizing and not be part of that? And it's, I mean, my experience is in, my primary labor experience is in factories, and people in that workplace understand the importance. But professors are just, I don't know, they're very hard to organize. They think it's not about them until it is, So I don't know. That's sort of a sociological question, I think, or anthropological. I don't know. if you have the answer to that, I'd be glad to know.
And anyone have any other questions, either about faculty organizing or radio or?
Yeah. So someone just says, how do we know when LPFM stations are open? Yeah, so that's the thing. That is the thing that I posted. If you go there, it's jammed with information. There is a link there that says, tell me about when there's LPFM licenses open. And I don't think there are any opening now for a little while, but if you're interested in getting that, it's good to get yourself organized now so you're in the wings, so that when it does open, you can jump on it and say, we already have a group of people and we know what we're doing. So you can even start, doing things in advance through like podcasting or something like that. Anyway, does anyone have any other questions? Otherwise, I'll, I don't know. I can give you, I'm going to give you my email address here in case anyone has any questions they want to contact me later. Happy to answer any questions that you think of later, or if people want to, I don't know, advice or anything else, I'd be happy to answer that.
Thank you, Jesse.
Okay, thank you so much.
So much.
Follow up at some point.
Okay, certainly do that.
So to do what you were talking about, where we actually build our own, do demystifying, that would be great at some point to do a follow up. And then, I'm sure a lot of stuff will come up as we think about it.
Yeah.
So maybe even just kind of another brainstorm session around organizing communication point would be great.
Jump around and listen to some of these LPFM stations from that RecNet site. You can connect all of them. It's really an interesting mix to see who's doing stuff out there. And the Syria thing is an interesting thing because I think that's a very viable project for an Arabic language network. I think that's a really good use of the technology, frankly. Okay, take care, everybody. See you.
Thank you. Thank you, Jesse, again. Thank you, everyone, for coming. Yes, I will. I'll send the recording.
Thanks, Anna.
Yeah.
May, are you still there?